Hello, I'm going to talk to you about day 7 of the Royal Commission's working. On day 7 we meet two people. We meet Toole, who is the Watchtower Society's solicitor that they use in Australia, and he works in-house and he lives at the branch office. And we meet O'Brien, who is the chairman of the branch committee. So when all these elders are saying we phone the branch, these are the people that they phone. If they get the legal department, they get Toole, and if they get the service department, they're getting something that has been overseen by O'Brien. So first of all, with Toole, the solicitor, Angus starts questioning him and saying, is there any document that outlines the roles and responsibilities of the branch office? And Toole says, not that I know of, no. He says, is there nothing that says, how you operate and who appoints the branch and how you stand in relation to the governing body? And he says, no, I don't know anything about this. Now, bear in mind that the day before, a document called the Branch Organisation Manual had been emailed to the Royal Commission by John Redwood. So when Angus is asking all these questions, he already knows that this document exists. He's just trying to establish who else knows about it. So the judge steps in and he says, are you a senior lawyer advising in Australia? And Toole really doesn't like this, and he says, no, I'm not a senior. He said, it's just that a lawyer would be asked normally in an organisation for legal advice in drafting any documents like this one. And he says, I'm not involved in advising for any documents at all. He denies all knowledge of any operation of how the branch works, despite being the senior solicitor and despite living at the branch and working at the branch. He doesn't know anything about it. Now, at this point, Tockley, who is the counsel for the Watchtower Society, he absolutely shits himself because he realises that the Royal Commission have got the branch operating manual. And he says, I assume that this is a very confidential document, he says. He's pretending, I don't know about it, but I'm just assuming it's a really confidential document. And he asks if they can have royal privilege to keep it confidential. He's absolutely crapping himself. And both Stewart and McClellan, the judge, say, well, we haven't read the document yet, so we don't know if it's confidential or not. And Tockley really argues strongly to keep this document confidential. So in the end, the judge agrees that he's going to release certain chapters into the public, 1, 3, 5 and 7, I think. And he's going to investigate whether the other chapters can be released or not. But as far as the judge is concerned, there's nothing confidential in there until he reads it. But it's just very interesting that Tockley knows about this document clearly and is crapping himself that anyone will find out about it, that it'll be published on the website. So are we to assume then that Tockley, the counsel for the Watchtower, does know about the branch operating manual, and that Toole, who works for the branch and in the branch and is the Watchtower solicitor in Australia, doesn't know about this document? It'll be interesting to see whether it comes out or not. Angus then goes on to talk to Toole about his statement. He says, your statement states the legal department has been instructed to direct. He says, who gave that instruction? And he says, the branch committee gives direction. So Toole in the legal department takes his instructions from the branch committee, and he refers to an October 1st 2012 letter about the instruction that he was given. So what Toole says in his statement is the legal department is given instructions by the branch committee to tell elders, to tell parents that they have an absolute right to go to the police. So Angus calls for this letter that Toole refers to, and he says to him, can you identify where in the letter the legal department is instructed to tell parents that they have an absolute right to report to the police? And Toole says, no, I can't, but it's in the spirit of what's being discussed there. So basically, Toole has referred to a letter and said, we've been told to say this, that parents can go to the police, and there is nothing at all mentioned in that letter that says that you can go to the police. So when Stuart says, where does it say in the letter? He then goes, oh, well, it's in the spirit of the letter. And herein lies the problem with the organisation, that sometimes something's written down, and at other times, if it's not written down, they can still rely on it by saying, well, it's in the spirit of the thing. And so basically they've got carte blanche to enforce whatever they want, whether it's written or not. So Angus says, you said in your statement you've been instructed, but now you're shifting your position. He says to him, you don't have any instruction, do you? It's not written at all. Later on, when they're talking about referring cases to the police, Toole says 383 times the authorities were involved in these abuse cases. Remember the 1,006 cases. And Angus won't let that pass at all. He says, no, that figure is based on a search of the word authority within the documents. It might have said, don't involve the authorities. The simple fact that the word authority was in a document regarding a child abuse case doesn't mean that the authorities were involved. But Toole, a solicitor, a trained professional, is happy to take that as evidence that in 383 times they referred it to the authorities. He says the fact is there were 1,006 cases that were never reported to the authorities. Toole says, well, I haven't been looking through those cases. So Toole admits that his legal department doesn't help in any of the drafting of any of the documents for the branch office. Now he says that they're not involved in any of those 1,006 sex abuse cases. And it leaves me wondering what on earth Toole does in his job, because all the normal jobs of a solicitor don't seem to be included in what he's doing. It seems that he doesn't do anything at all. Later on, Angus Stewart talks to Toole about some letters that have been written to him, to the legal department. He says BCB writes to the branch. He asks Toole, have you seen this letter, where she says that she's concerned about her abuser's continued access to children because he's been reinstated. So around about after 2000 sometimes she writes to the branch when this man's been reinstated and says he's still around children. Angus says, what did you do in response to this letter? I don't recall. He says, if I'd received a letter like that, I would have taken it to the service department, because that's to do with the service department. That's nothing to do with the legal department. Again, what does he do? Angus carries on, and now 10 days later you get a letter from BCK, who's one of the other daughters. She details the abuse as well. What did you do? Well, I must have taken it to the service department. Angus says, did you follow up with the service department, what they did? I don't recall. So Angus then said to him, well, I'll tell you what you did. This is what you did in response to these two letters about this child abuser being reinstated and having access to children in the congregation. He says, you wrote a letter to ask the two elders to approach him. He says, this suggests that you didn't take the letters to the service department. You wrote this letter. And Toole says, well, this is a matter for the service department. He says, Mr. Toole, this letter carries your reference on it. He says, and it contains information about legal issues. You seem to be trying to distance yourself from it now. He says, are you suggesting that this letter came from the service department? He says, no, it was sent with the approval of the service department. Right, he says, sent with the approval, but written and signed by you. He says, well, I didn't sign the letter. No, because have you noticed, they never sign the letters. The letters are not signed from a human being. They're stamped with a stamp that says, your loving brothers, Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, or something like that, the Christian congregation, Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. They're never signed. Now, whether they thought that that would get them out of any legal liability for who did what, I don't know. So Toole relies on that. Well, I didn't sign it. He says, but the letter has your reference on it. He says, are you saying that you didn't approve it? Well, it all goes back to the service department. We're just assisting them, he says. So where all the elders have passed everything up and said we phone the branch, now the man in the legal department at the branch is passing everything up and said, well, everything's the service department. I don't do anything. On video 2, we're still with Toole, and I think it's Gallagher. It's one of the women that then question him. And in part, he says to her, Toole says to her, I can assure you that whatever needs to be done to protect a child, we would do it. If it means going to the authorities, we would do it. And this begs the question, if they're willing to do anything that needs to be done to protect a child, what happened in those 1006 cases? What were they doing there that constitutes anything to protect a child, including going to the authorities? You see, it's all right saying we'd do anything, but your words mean nothing if your track record shows that you've never done anything. I could tell you that I wash up every day, and then never wash up at all. The fact that I've said it doesn't mean it's happened. So then she moves on and she says, in video 2, round about minute 38, if you want to watch it, she says, are you aware of the doctrine of theocratic warfare? Now, bear in mind, I think somebody's sent them information about the doctrine of theocratic warfare already, so they know about it. He says, no. She says, you're not aware of this doctrine at all. He says, well, I've heard of it, but I don't know what it means. And then she reads him a description of it out of a 1957 article, which in my opinion is a bit of a schoolboy error because that's quite an old article. He says, well, I've not read magazines from 1957. She said, you would be aware of the concept that you can lie to protect Jehovah's name, and it is really indignant. We're truthful, he says, we're truthful. She says, you know, falsehoods presented to outsiders are not considered lying if it's to advance Jehovah's purpose. He says, I've never heard of that. It's completely foreign to my understanding. But here's the kicker. I know somebody that sent a letter in from the Australia branch in 1988, roughly, that discusses theocratic warfare. And so he can plead whatever he likes that it's alien to his understanding. But the fact that millions of ex-Jehovah's Witnesses around the world know all about theocratic warfare begs to differ with what he pleads. So he says that he only advises about whether there's mandatory reporting or not. So his only job, according to him, is not to advise on letters. It's not to talk about sex abuse cases. His only job is to answer the phone when an elder phones up and tell them whether they live in a mandatory reporting state or not. Well, I can tell you that. If you live in Queensland, New South Wales, or Victoria, you live in a mandatory reporting state. If you don't, you're not in a mandatory reporting state. I could do his job. Okay. We then move on to Terence O'Brien, who is sworn in. Now, Terence is the coordinator of the Australia branch, okay, and he is the coordinator of the branch committee that's a 12-man committee. So he's asked what scope is there in Australia for the Australia branch to suggest changes, and he indicates that it all has to be reviewed and okayed by the governing body. And Angus Stewart says, is that because the governing body are seen as Jehovah's representatives on earth who give scriptural interpretation? And he has to agree that's true. He says, so there's no scope for a branch to adopt a different scriptural interpretation? No. Well, we knew that. He then brings up the BOM again, the Branch Organisation Manual 2012. He says to Terence O'Brien, are you familiar with this manual? Being the coordinator of the branch committee, you would hope so. He says, yes, I am. So he says, the branch office does not publish anything independently of the governing body. He says, well, we have a writing desk. And then he goes through some information in the branch organisation manual about the different committees. And it just sounds like a nice general conversation. He says, You're aware that this manual lists the different committees of the governing body. It lists the Coordinators Committee, that deals with the legal stuff and media. It lists the Teaching Committee, that deals with spiritual food delivered worldwide. And O'Brien's saying yes, yes. Now, Angus knows that Geoffrey Jackson, the member of the governing body, is the head of the Teaching Committee. But he also knows that they've been told, and therefore the Watchtower think, that the Royal Commission think that Jackson is only involved in translation work and has nothing else to do. But Angus knows. That's why he's asking O'Brien all this information about these committees and what they do, and what the responsibility is. He gets O'Brien to agree that the faithful and discreet slave is synonymous with the governing body. Nice little reiteration of new light there. It used to be a big group and now it's not, it's just 7 men. Yes, that's right, says O'Brien. It says this manual sets out the rules by which the worldwide organisation operates. It's right down to who may communicate with whom and by what medium. So Angus has gone through this document and he's got O'Brien to admit that it says this person can email that person, this person must write to that person. It's very, very prescriptive. That information is banked for later. O'Brien thinks he's on safe ground. So then Angus moves on to a redress scheme about compensation. You know, if somebody's been hurt by the actions of your organisation, do you have a redress scheme whereby they can claim compensation and, for instance, pay for the counselling and the psychotherapy that they need? And O'Brien says, well, we've never had a request for it. And Angus says, well, it may be that there have been no requests because there's never been a scheme. Circular reasoning, isn't it? So then he discusses a collective scheme. He says, you know that we've discussed this issue with lots of other organisations as part of the Royal Commission's work. And this has been on the table for several months, a redress scheme. And we're looking at a group redress scheme where all these little organisations put into a pot, and then if somebody needs to claim, I suppose a bit like religious child abuse insurance, isn't it? If somebody needs to claim, then they can do. Well, they shit themselves at the prospect of having to cooperate with any other organisation. He says, well, I can't see that happening. I can't see us cooperating with other groups because it might be that we do our own redress scheme. We'll do it on our own. And he's bringing up all these pathetic excuses. He goes, well, it might not be fair to different organisations because some will be smaller than others. My contention is it might not be fair to other organisations because I suspect there aren't many other organisations that have the sheer volume of claimants that the Jehovah's Witnesses will have. Some of the other organisations have had 1 or 2 abusers within their Royal Commission investigation. We've had 1,006. That's a lot of claimants. So saying, no, we're a small organisation, it might not be fair. Look. I'm quite sure that an averagely intelligent man could work out a fair pro rata way of divvying up everybody's contributions according to the size of the organisation and the number of claimants. But again, they absolutely shit themselves at that prospect. Okay. Then Angus goes back to Mr. Jackson, the member of the governing body. He says he is a member of the writing committee and the teaching committee. He is the head or responsible for the teaching committee. And O'Brien says, oh, well, he's not the head. He just coordinates the work of the teaching committee. He's trying to argue that Jackson is not in charge of the teaching committee. Angus says, yes, that's what I'm saying. He coordinates the teaching committee. At which point O'Brien says, oh, I don't know. Because he suddenly realises that even just saying he coordinates it is going to drop him in the shit. So then he pretends he doesn't know, having argued that he did know that he's not responsible for it. He's just coordinating it. Angus says, Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of Australia said that Mr. Jackson would not be able to assist this commission because his role is only in translation, which is in clear variance to what you've just explained in your evidence. And then O'Brien tries to tie himself in knots, trying to explain that the translation committee is under the teaching committee, so it wasn't really a lie. Jackson is part of the translation committee, which is part of the teaching committee, and his role is mainly translation. The judge then steps in and says, Mr. O'Brien, did you give these instructions to senior counsel to say that Mr. Jackson was only part of the translation committee and would be of no use to the proceedings? He said, you led us to believe that he would be of no use. I'm starting to form a totally different impression of it. Then Angus moves on to something else. He backs off. O'Brien thinks he's off the hook again. Angus establishes that disassociating has the same effects as disfellowshipping, and he goes through lots of documents to establish that. Then he gives this scenario. He says, what if an abused person feels so upset and disenchanted with the fact that you haven't dealt with their abuser and their abuser is still in the congregation that they want to disassociate themselves? He says they have an impossible choice of staying in an organisation that protects their abuser or losing all their family. And O'Brien is saying, yes, but they understand the consequences of disassociating. They don't have to do that. They could just leave and stop associating. So O'Brien himself describes in a roundabout way the process of fading. He says that that's a viable option to not be cut off. But we know that's not true. We know that some people who fade still get cut off anyway. Angus says, would you accept that it is psychologically devastating and cruel? And then again, I think here, Angus in his next comment refers to the deluge of information that has been emailed into him over the last few days from ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, because then he says to O'Brien, do you appreciate that this one point of shunning probably makes people the most angry around the world among ex-Jehovah's Witnesses? Brilliant point. Towards the very end of the third video, about 1 hour 47 minutes, then it gets serious again, and we're really looking at perjury here. Angus says, Mr. O'Brien, you gave instructions to counsel, that's to Mr. Tockley, that Mr. Jackson would be of no use to the commission. I put it to you that the instructions you gave were false. Now this is massive. In the British House of Commons, MPs are not allowed to say that other MPs are liars. It is such a strong allegation that you have to be absolutely sure. And as I said, in the House of Commons, you're not even allowed to say it. You have to use a euphemism, like I think my learned colleague has misled us, or I think my learned colleague may have got his facts wrong. But here, Stewart accuses him of lying, and that is massive, because the consequences of lying to a commission are huge. And he says no. He says those instructions sought to mislead the commission and protect Mr. Jackson from our summons to appear. He says no, and he starts waffling on about his father being ill. And then Stewart says, Mr. O'Brien, how do we know if what you say about Mr. Jackson's compassionate circumstances are true? He's saying, given that you've lied to us, how do we know that that's not a lie? Now that is a terrible, terrible position to be in, that you're in a court, you've sworn on oath, you're the highest Jehovah's Witness in Australia in terms of hierarchy, and a council says he's unable to believe what you say anymore because of your history of lying. So he says, well, we could bring a doctor's, we could get a doctor's note or something. And I think, what an embarrassing position to be in, that you've got to prove that you're telling the truth by getting a doctor's note to say his dad's ill. So right at the end, after O'Brien has been dismissed, then Tockley, the counsel for the Watchtower, stands up and is very, very obsequious. And some people feel that he's actually trying to distance himself from the Watchtower a little bit, because he says, I in no way did I seek to mislead Your Honour. And he keeps saying, Your Honour, Your Honour. So what the judge says is this. He says, Mr. Tockley, what we want from you is a draft of revisions. He says, we want you to produce a document that identifies what your problems are and what you're going to do about them. Now, what the Watchtower representatives have said so far, what O'Brien said in part was, when he was asked what would you do about it, he said, well, we're in no way against mandatory reporting. If you make that the law, we'll do it. The judge is saying something different. He's not saying, we'll make the law, we'll tell you what to do when you do it. He's saying, you tell me, what are you going to do? He's saying, you own responsibility for your mistakes. Tell me what mistakes you've made and tell me what you're going to do about it. He's not giving them an easy ride. He's not saying, I'm going to tell you what to do and I'm going to change the law and then you can do it and then we can all be happy. He's asking them to take responsibility. He says, you tell us what the problems are and what you intend to do about it. He says, if we don't like it, we'll say so. And if it doesn't go far enough, we'll say that too. He says, and in 2 years' time, we'll revisit the situation. We'll come back to you. He says, we've done this to all the other organisations we've looked at. We'll come back to you and we'll make sure that you're doing what you've said you'll do. And I think that is a fascinating point. Because often when you're talking to a child, when a child's done something naughty, I'm a teacher, a child's done something naughty, you don't just want to tell them off. What you want them to do is understand that what they've done is wrong. If they've hurt another child, you want them to acknowledge that. Yes, miss, I called him a name and it was mean. And I understand now that that's upset him and I'm going to go and say sorry. You don't want to say, go and say sorry to so-and-so for doing this. And he goes, sorry. And you know that he's not sorry at all. You want him to accept responsibility, to think about what he's done, think about why it's wrong and what he can do to put it right. And that's what the judge is asking the members of the branch committee in Australia. And of course, we've got more to come because hopefully, they will subpoena Jeffrey Jackson and they'll be able to speak to him. But just like I've said before, doesn't matter if they don't subpoena him, they can still deal with what they've got. And the Australia branch have still been told that they must produce a report and identify the mistakes and identify what they're going to do about it. Not wait and be told what the law is. What are you? Be proactive, be responsible. What are you going to do about it? So thank you for listening to another long one.